What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today is an exciting day. Behind me sits a brand new machine to our shop, the beautiful Lion 32-inch lathe. Now, I've been wanting a large lathe ever since I got my eyes on a small lathe. And I'm sure I will buy larger lathes than this in the future. But for now, this is a machine that I've wanted and I've had for a year. I left it uncleaned and cluttered up so that you could just see what its life has been like over the past year while it's been waiting for me to touch it. I've used it mostly as a shelf, and I've been collecting tooling that I have stored underneath. I've got steady rest that are from other machines. I've got lathe chucks. I've got tool holders, a DRO, just preparing for the day when I can go ahead and spend the time to go through this machine and to get it ready and up to my standards, and most importantly, ready to do work. So this video is going to be the beginning of a very long series over multiple months where I go through this machine and get it ready to produce chips and to produce precise, accurate work in an enjoyable fashion. So the plan or the project for this lathe is to go through it. It is not going to be anything like the blue lathe that I did. We're not pulling it apart and doing a crazy paint job. No. The goal here is to go through the machine and to make sure it is functioning as good as possible with a very particular focus on function and looks as an afterthought. Now, will we be repainting this? Of course we will. But really it's just because we're going to be cleaning it up and stripping the paint and painting it. Most of what we're going to be doing here is making sure everything is tight, making adjustments. We might do some scraping on the top slide. We're going to be installing a brand new high quality tool post. I do have a DRO for it that it came with, but we might upgrade that. I got a brand new chuck for it, so we're going to be making a backing plate, and overall we're just going to be going through this lathe and making sure it is functioning as good as possible and it is in the best chance for success when it comes to making clean, accurate parts so that it can be a workhorse for our workshop. My hope is that this lathe will single-handedly be the most important piece of equipment in this shop, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that it is the biggest machine. So with the gap out, it will swing about 42 inches, and with the gap in, it does 31.5. And having a large machine is important to do a variety of jobs. The other thing is that this machine does both inch and metric, and it's the only machine in my shop that can do metric, and that is huge. And lastly, and possibly most importantly, this lathe is in the best shape out of any piece of equipment in this shop. I know it may not look it based on the appearance, but the lathe has an extremely small amount of wear, and it was extremely well taken care of by the previous owner, and we'll get more into that in the future. So let's get in close to the machine and talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing. All right, we're over here at the headstock, and I want to talk about the backstory of where I got this lathe and why it's so special. So I actually got this lathe at an auction in Farmersburg, Indiana, from a gentleman who had passed named Robert Buckner. His wife did an auction to get rid of a lot of his old stuff, and I was lucky enough to win this lathe. And I didn't know the guy, but based on what some of his friends were saying about him, he seemed like a kind of guy that was always around to help everyone and let many people work out of his shop, and was just a kind and generous man. And we went there and we purchased the machinery, and we came back and loaded it up, and on our way out we actually got pulled over by a policeman, and I was pretty nervous, and he came up to us and said, "Hey, I recognize that machine." I said, "You do?" We were like an hour away from the place we had purchased it. And basically he had known Robert, and he was telling a story about how Robert let him come over and work on some of his projects on this lathe. and that was really, really cool. And so part of the beauty of this machine is just realizing the beauty and the joy that Robert had owning this machine and knowing that we can bring more life to the machine. And I think knowing that makes me feel really cool about bringing this to life and putting it to work. I think he would have really appreciated that. And I think what's really cool is the condition of this lathe and the great condition it's in is a direct result of his hard work and diligence, and we get to build on top of that. And so I really wanted to highlight that story as a part of this video because I think that's really important. The other question I want to address is, why did I get a Lion lathe? A lot of you guys may not have heard of Lion, and I didn't either. I really wanted an old Monarch or an old pacemaker or even a LeBlanc lathe, something really high quality, old school. But there's a couple major issues with the older school lathes that I just didn't want to deal with. And the first thing is that they have a small spindle. Now I know some of the LeBlancs have the oil field lathes, but by and large, old Monarchs, pacemakers, they have a small spindle comparatively to the size of the chuck or the swing. The other thing is a lot of them don't offer metric threading. And a lot of those features have been addressed in the newer machines built in the last 20 or 30 years. But the problem is the machines made in the last 20 or 30 years aren't made at the level of quality that the machines made in the 40s, 50s, and 60s are made. So if it was possible, I wanted to see if I could kind of have my cake and eat it too and get a machine that was made just like a Monarch or a Regal or a pacemaker with high quality, but have some of the features of some of the newer machines that were imported. Large spindle bore, powered carriage, metric threading, stuff like that. And doing some research, I actually stumbled across a video by Josh at Topper Machine where he purchased a brand new Lion lathe. And I watched it and was quite surprised because he has a lot of old iron, and called Johnny over at Inner Machine Corporation and talked to him and really felt really good about buying a Lion lathe. And one of the main things that sets them apart compared to some of the other newer lathe manufacturers is they have a clutched lathe. So even like Summit and Kingston, some of these larger lathe manufacturers today, they don't offer a clutched lathe, and Lion still does. And these lathes are made in Bulgaria and they're imported over. And so they're made at a little bit higher quality standard, but they offer some of those features that some of the other manufacturers don't offer. And I actually had Johnny run me up a quote for this same machine, but I think it was like 3 feet longer, and it was gonna be around 100 grand. And it's worth it. It's a quality machine. But where my shop is at, it just didn't make any sense for me to drop about $100,000 on a nice machine like this. So I wanted to see if I could find a Lion lathe used, and I did. I got lucky. I found this machine and it was in great shape. And that's kind of a little bit of the backstory as to why I went with a Lion compared to some of the other models out there. Let's talk about the build quality of these machines. Now let me just say I am not a manufacturer and I am not an expert, but I am a consumer and I have used several different machines. So my comparison is only going to be of the machines that I've used and seen and based on some of the specs that I can look up. So it is limited, but here's what's interesting to me. When you look at my pacemaker lathe and you look at the fact that it's only a 14-inch swing and you measure the carriage on that in this dimension, the carriage is 26 inches. That's massive, right? Now, in the pacemaker's defense, that carriage is the same size carriage that's used on the lathes all the way up to 30 inches, I believe. I think they just insert a riser block underneath the headstock and tailstock. So that carriage is suited for a bigger lathe. But if you look at my Colchester lathe, the carriage is like 12 inches, and the swing isn't that much different. And when you look at a new machine, like a new Kingston or even the new Lion lathes, like the lathe that Josh has, I don't know what the measurement is, but the measurement on this is at least 6 to 8 inches shorter than this carriage. And what I have gathered from that is The old stuff is so ridiculously overbuilt that as time went on, people realized that the old stuff was a little bit unnecessarily overbuilt. So what they've done is they've shrunken the size of the castings because they deem that it's unnecessary. And that's correct. It probably is unnecessary in terms of actual use case, but the benefit of large castings and large carriages and large tailstocks is rigidity, number one, and number two, the larger the contact surface, the longer the machine is going to last because it's going to wear more evenly and it's going to wear out far less than something with a smaller carriage and a smaller footprint. So when I look at the carriage of this lathe and I compare it to my pacemaker, for example, this carriage is actually bigger by 4 inches. I think it's like 30 inches across, which is excellent. And it's even bigger than the one on the updated machine from Lion. I believe the newer Lion machine doesn't have these wings on the end, but correct me if I'm wrong. And so the way that this carriage is built is extremely beefy, based on the size and the shape of the lathe. And that's something that I really, really appreciate about this lathe is that beefy build quality. Some other things, just some facts, the weight. So the weight of this machine is around 12 to 14,000 pounds. And I don't have an exact number just because the records are a little bit hazy, but just based on pulling this machine and comparing it to some of the 10,000 pound machines, as well as unloading it, and based on the specs, I'm seeing that it's probably closer to 14. I know that the longer version of this is closer to 20, the 12-foot between bed. So just based on some math, it seems like it's around 14,000 pounds. And my pacemaker, for comparison, which is a smaller swing, is around 9,000 pounds. And a Summit lathe of the same size is about 10 to 12,000 pounds. So the actual size of the lathe and the casting is very adequate and very overkill, I would say, and very on par with some of the older machines in terms of the weight and size. Like when you take a look at the casting, and I'll give you like a shot of some B-roll of this, the casting underneath the ways is like 2 foot thick right here under the gap, which is crazy. And the width across the bed is 22 inches about, 21 and a quarter, I believe it is. The bed on my pacemaker is 16. So some of the newer Summit lathes do have a wide 22-inch bed, but a lot of the lathes that have the wider 22-inch bed or even wider are a lot of the oil field or extra heavy-duty machines. So I feel like this machine falls into that extra heavy-duty category, which is really, really nice. Just some other things to kind of talk about, the tailstock. Now the tailstock itself is massive. Give you a shot of it here. And I'll just throw a measurement on this. I don't know, probably 20 inches or something. Yeah, 22 inches. And what's crazy is as big of a swing as this is at 32 inches, it's not that much bigger than the tailstock on my pacemaker, which just goes to show you how overbuilt the pacemaker tailstock is. It is bigger and it is heavier, but you know, the tailstock on other lathes of this size is significantly smaller. And so having a beefy, large, overbuilt tailstock really makes a difference in terms of wear and rigidity. And I think that's just the theme of this lathe, is this lathe is big, it's beefy, and it's overkill. And even talking to Johnny about the manufacturing of these lathes, he has indicated to me that the newer lathes are actually about 2,000 pounds lighter and the bed is a little bit smaller because they found that this was unnecessarily overkill and people don't need that. And I'm sure that's true, but to have the bigger bed and to have the extra couple thousand pounds in casting, it's nice. It may not be necessary, but it's nice, and it should help the machine last longer and be even smoother and more steady. And so I feel really good about that in terms of the quality. The other crazy thing about this lathe is the condition. So when you look at a lathe's bed, it kind of tells you the story of its life. And most of the lathes that I've ever purchased were either used at a school or a factory or a shop, and they have had a rough life. That is not the case with this lathe. The gentleman, Robert, who owned this, had this in his home shop. And when I say home shop, I don't know, it must have been 5,000 square feet between a couple buildings. So it was big, but this lathe did not get a lot of use, and he took very, very good care of it. A friend of his told me that anytime he had any black oil on the lathe ways, he would wipe it away immediately and make sure it didn't get under the carriage. And what that tells me is this guy was incredibly meticulous about maintaining the quality of the lathe. And that kind of leads me to assume that this machine is going to be in amazing shape. I have never seen a used lathe that is 20 or 30 years old where the ways look as good as this machine. It's just crazy to me. So I am hoping that based on what I'm seeing here and based on the stories that I had heard when I was purchasing this machine, that this machine is going to have very little wear, and it's going to be in excellent shape and require very minimal work. We'll see once we start to get into it. We've talked a lot about the great things about this machine, but no machine is perfect. And so there are two cons about this machine that are really unfortunate and can't really be changed. The most obvious con, which I'm just kicking myself about, but there's nothing I can do, is this machine is not long enough. If this machine had an extra 4 feet, man, I would just be so happy. Because with all the effort and time and quality and condition this machine is, it is absolutely perfect. And it is bigger than my pacemaker by about 1.5 feet. I think it has 80 inches between center to center, which is great. You can easily fit 6 feet between the chuck, but I really, really wanted 8 to 10 foot, maybe even a 12-foot swing for some of those big jobs. And with this lathe being short, it's just a little bit unideal in my opinion. Now the tailstock's pretty big. I can slide it off the bed about halfway, and I can get about 7 feet between here and here, and that's big, right? But I would just have loved to be able to get a machine that I could throw a 10-foot roller, an 8-foot roller in, and be able to properly machine. And that isn't this machine, unfortunately. So yes, I'm going to be looking for a 12-plus foot lathe at some point in the future because it can't be this machine. And that is incredibly unfortunate. But it is what it is, and this machine is still going to be excellent for anything within that work envelope. But hey, if you're going to spend a bunch of time and money on something, it'd be nice if you didn't have to, you know, need another machine for some of those longer jobs. The other thing is the spindle mount is terrible. On this machine it has, I forget what it's called exactly, but a European C-style mount. And what that means is there's like 8 bolts on the back and you have to unbolt it, and then this chuck slides out, and it's fine. It's not the end of the world, but it makes changing the chuck from something that would be like a 5-minute job with like a cam lock to like a 10-minute job. And finding a back plate is not really possible because they use it in Europe and it's kind of outdated. And so that kind of sucks. But other than those two things, this lathe really does have pretty much everything I want for a lathe of this size and this style. Now this video has had a lot of talking, and if you don't like that, I apologize, but I really wanted to be thorough and honest and give a little bit of insight as to how I approach a project like this and a little bit of the backstory, pros and cons before we even lift a tool or get started. And one last thing I want to touch on before we kind of wrap this video up and get to actually working on it is what's in store for the project. What can you look for? What are the other videos going to be about? That kind of stuff. So we're going to go through this machine. I'm going to strip all the paint. I'm going to get it all cleaned up, and I'm going to focus on figuring out what's wrong with it and or getting it into the best shape possible. Now with that being said, it is my assumption that this machine could be wired up, turned on, and used within 2 hours and be good to go. And that's probably true because it does appear to be in excellent shape. When I went to inspect it, I inspected for wear, I set up an indicator, I spent like 30 minutes with it. It checked out great. The machine is fine, but I want to do a couple things to the machine to bring it to where I want to have it operate. So the first things first, over here at the carriage, we have a little bit of backlash here. A lot of backlash, I would say. I want to address that. It's not a big deal, can be used. That's the only like problem that I know with this lathe. So we're going to be addressing that. The other thing I want to address or look at is the wear in this top slide. I might be doing some scraping on that just because I want an excuse to practice my scraping. And also I want to make sure that's as tight as possible. So we're going to be looking at that and potentially doing scraping there or measuring, talking about that. The other thing is tool post. It came with a Dorian D50 tool post, which is excellent. That's a high quality tool post. But I went and I bought the best tool post I could find, which is a Dorian Quadra Index tool post. It's one of the ones that Curtis has. It has 4 positions, it swivels, it's amazing. So we are going to be installing that. I'll be going over that. Steady rests. When I purchased this machine, it did not have a steady rest, which I hate. Always get a steady rest with a machine. And I've spent the last year of my life, while this has been sitting, trying to find a steady rest. And guess what? It's really hard to find a steady rest. I did, however, get lucky and be able to purchase 3 of these steady rests for $500, which is super cheap, and they are close, but they're about 1 inch too tall. So we may either modify or build steady rest or steady rests for this machine. So that's going to be part of this project. Tooling. So I have 2 Bison Morris Taper 6 centers. I have a Jacobs 18-in chuck that's brand new. So are the Bison centers. And I have a bunch of Bison stuff that I got for the tailstock when a Bison factory was going out of business. So it's new in-box stuff and it's in really great shape. It's just dirty, but it's new. So I got that. I've been collecting boring bars and other small tooling, and we'll be buying additional tooling to make sure that all of these Dorian holders are fully stocked and ready to go with high quality tooling. When it comes to chucks, this is a Bison 20-inch cast iron chuck that is in very good shape. It's extremely expensive. It's probably worth what I paid for the lathe. And that chuck is excellent. And I actually acquired another Bison 20-inch 3-jaw chuck that was never used on a lathe, only used in the lab. So we're going to be making a backing plate for that chuck so it can be used, or purchasing one. Coolant. The coolant pump on this lathe doesn't work. It never worked from day one when Robert bought it. I'm sure it worked before that. So I have 2 brand new coolant pumps down there that I got at a bargain. So we're going to be addressing the coolant issue. We're going to be building a coolant tank chip tray because right now there's nothing. So that'll be a crazy build in itself. It'll be on wheels and it'll be a whole deal. I'm going to be making a filter tank and all that kind of stuff. DRO, it came with a DRO. It seems to be working fine. We got to install that. And it was mounted on a tool post over here on the back, but I want to modify that tool post so that it can accept the DRO and add coolant and a flexible hose. So we're going to sort all that out. We're getting new badges for the machine. A little bit unnecessary, but it's a little bit of a splurge for this project. I'm having the one and only Vaughn Industrial redo this badge and these 2 badges. It really looks like one on camera here, just for functionality's sake. Not really on this one, but more so on this one. It's pretty badly beat up, and I want to be able to come over to the machine and look at my speeds and feeds and be able to read it legibly for many years. So I'm having him redo that, and it'll be legit on aluminum. It's molded, it'll be beautiful. New belts, obviously. And other than that, we're just going to go through the machine and really make sure it's working good. We'll do new leveling feet. We'll get it leveled and in place. Yeah, I think that's about it. The other thing I really would love to do, and this isn't part of the lathe, but it's kind of a part of the project, is I would love to get a very large, like 50-inch Lista cabinet right in front of me where I can put all the metrology stuff in my shop, and I can put all the tool holders, so that way when I'm standing at the machine, I can turn around and my tool holders are right here, and I can kind of roll the cart around if I need to make room. So a lot of stuff, a lot of moving pieces, a lot of cool projects, but that is what is in store for this machine and for this project. And it is my hope that once this is done, it'll have all of the best accessories, it'll be extremely accurate, in great shape, well taken care of, up to date on oil and service and belts, and ready to make chips for many years to come. So as we start this build process, if you have any comments, post them down below, and I hope you enjoy going through this large machine.